Halloween. A time that in this day and age has been overrun by the specter of commercialism. As children dress up in costume to roam the streets in their relentless quest for confectionaries that will undoubtedly fill their young bellies, blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurk in the night. Meanwhile, content creators live in fear of algorithms more frightening than any werewolf, vampire, or necromancer. These are dark times. Times without hope. All we can do is make our voices heard in the vain hope that our words will reach the powers that be.
And in the meantime, we can play video games and then talk about them.
Like many other gamers out there are a few franchises that I tend to talk about on multiple occasions. Mega Man, Monster Hunter, several Nintendo franchises, and especially around this time of year, Castlevania. I've made several videos about this topic, dating back to when I was doing this stuff on a laptop. That laptop was kinda crap, not gonna lie. Anyways, I've played most of the games in the series, at least in the main timeline. However, there's been an anomaly that I haven't had that much inclination to pay attention to up until now. Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Serving as a reboot to the series, this game has a mixed reception among fans of the franchise.
I personally wasn't that interested in the reboot at first, but during Free Comic Book Day this past year, I found it at a comic book store for $5. And considering that there's going to be a lot of Castlevania representation in Smash Bros. Ultimate, and since Konami recently re-released 2 big-name Castlevania titles on PS4, I figured this was good at Halloween as any to give this game a fair shot. Hey, at least now I can have my own opinion on the game instead of hopping on some bandwagon.
So, let's start by talking about how this thing came to life from the slab. Sales of the more recent Castlevania games weren't so hot, so Konami wanted to expand the franchise. Many prototypes were pitched to be the next game, but the one that stuck was developed by a company called Mercury Steam. Metroid fans may remember these guys as the people who did Metroid Samus Punches Aliens. Originally, the devs were told that the game would be its own IP, and a teaser was shown at Gamescom in 2008 simply called Lords of Shadow. Unfortunately, the game was nearly sent to an early grave. Enter David Cox, one of the game's producers, who showed the game to the higher-ups in Japan, and who else would step up and offer his aid than the legendary madman himself, Hideo Kojima. With the support of these two, the project was greenlit as the new Castlevania. The original plan for the project was a reimagining of the original, with series icon and now Smash rep Simon Belmont as the protagonist, but it was eventually decided to make the game a hard reboot instead with a new story. The game was released in 2010, in October no less, for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. An Ultimate Edition would follow in 2013, which included a Windows port. For the sake of this review, I played the PS3 version, so my experiences will be based on that.
So, now that we've gone over how we got to this point, let's dig up this grave and see if this monster still belongs in this world.
Okay, first things first. You know all that juicy, intricate Castlevania lore? Well, you take it, fold it in half, and tuck it away because you won't be needing it here. This story, being a hard reboot, crafts its own plot which is completely separate from the familiar timeline. The story, narrated by Captain Picard himself, Sir Patrick Stewart, takes place in the year 1047, placing it even before when Lament of Innocence would have taken place in the main timeline. The world has gone to hell, both figuratively and as close to literally as it gets, being besieged by creatures of the night. In the midst of this chaos appears our protagonist, Gabriel Belmont. Because it's not Castlevania if the Belmont clan isn't involved in some way, it's kind of a series bylaw. Gabe is a member of the Brotherhood of Light and has been sent to find the Lake of Oblivion. The first chapter follows him to said lake, where he has an audience with the old god Pan in order to seek his aid. Upon passing Pan's trial, which has him saving the spirit of his dead wife in a vision, he sees himself in a rather disturbing mask. This will come back later. After the vision, he confronts the lake's guardian, a giant ice titan. After struggling against the Titan, narrator Picard shows up and helps our protag finish the job. After the fight, he meets with the spirit of his wife, Marie. Turns out the Earth has been cut off from the heavens, leaving the spirits of the dead in limbo. And the spirits of the founders of the Brotherhood have told Marie that the power of the Lords of Shadow is the key to saving the world. This is immediately confirmed thereafter by narrator Picard, who's actually a Brotherhood member named Zobek, who motivates Gabriel to help him with the hope of reviving Marie. Because that's obviously not a red flag, am I right?
Now, from here on out, we're going into spoiler territory, so if you don't want to be spoiled, just click the timestamp up here, okay? We good? Good.
The main game takes place over 12 chapters, which comprise 3 main story arcs. After the aforementioned Chapter 1, which serves as the prologue, the first act begins. This act follows Gabriel into the heart of a ruined city called Egharda. You mean Albus's weapon from Order of Ecclesia? This place was the capital of a once great civilization which has long since been overrun by the Lycans. That's werewolves for those unfamiliar with the term. As he ventures into the ruins, he meets a mute telepath named Claudia, and the ancestor of Alphonse Elric, who serves as her guardian. After passing her test, she goes with him, as she tells him of the civilization that once dwelled within the city walls. Turns out these ancient dudes had a bunch of ancient tech, including those Titans, the last of which falls to Gabriel with Claudia's help. Shortly afterwards, the adventurers stop to rest, but then Gabriel kills Claudia. Except it was all a dream. Only it wasn't. Now Gabriel believes himself to be turning into a cold-blooded killer, and apparently the Black Knight agrees. Gabriel fights the Knight and claims its gauntlet, allowing him to proceed into the heart of the ruins to confront the first of the Lords of Shadow, the Lord of the Lycans, Cornell. You mean the protagonist of Legacy of Darkness? It's here that we get a bit of backstory. As it so happens, the founders of the Brotherhood of Light fought against the minions of Satan long ago, and upon driving off his forces, left their darkness behind and became ethereal beings. And then the darkness became the 3 Lords of Shadow. Naturally, Gabriel initially denies that his enemies are the dark sides of the founders of his order, but nevertheless he fights and defeats Cornell, upon which he receives his power and a piece of what's called the God Mask, which is said to hold unfathomable power. 1 chapter-length intermission and a fight with a Crow Witch later, we enter the second act, which takes place in the cold, where the vampires roam. Here, Gabriel meets up with Zobek in the last inhabited village in this 9th circle of a hellhole, because there's a treasure here that will help him against the bloodsuckers. Unfortunately, it's being guarded by an abbot gone mad and hidden in an abbey loaded with traps. And no sooner do they obtain it than the village is attacked by the vampire Bronner. You mean the vampire from Portrait of Ruin? Anyways, after defeating Bronner, Gabriel makes his way to the vampire's castle. His first big obstacle is a game of chess with a vampire girl named Laura, who does not take losing well, as he later learns. The only thing saving Gabriel's life is the intervention of Marie's ghost, which causes Laura to take pity on him. Held together only by his love of Marie, which, let's be honest, is the only thing keeping him sane at this point, he proceeds to confront the Vampire Lord's guardian, Olrox. You mean that vampire from Symphony of the Night? Upon defeating him, he opens the way to the second Lord, the Vampire Queen Carmilla. You mean Dracula's loyal consort from across the old timeline? She tries to seduce Gabriel, but it's hard to do that to someone whose heart could freeze a furnace by this point. Gabriel kicks her ass and obtains the second piece of the mask. Once again, enter Pan, who opens the way to the final act of the main story. By this point, Gabriel has realized the truth about the Brotherhood and the Lords of Shadow, and his faith is beyond shaken.
What am I fighting for?
But Pan hints that there's a bigger truth behind everything. Which takes us into the final act. It begins with Gabriel, with his soul becoming darker by the second, venturing into the swamp to meet a witch named Baba Yaga, who knew Gabriel was coming because the King of the Angels told her. This will also come back later. She offers to open the way to the domain of the necromancers after he passes her test. After getting 3 keys to a music box from evil scarecrows, she transports him into the box, where he's tasked with finding a blue rose. Okay, Konami, we get it! Upon finding the rose, she transports Gabriel to the land of the dead, after which Zobek transports her to the afterlife in a more permanent fashion. After crossing the Titan's graveyard, he meets Pan one last time, who challenges our protagonist, can't really call him a hero right now, to one last fight, which Gabriel wins by understanding how to use opposing elements. In his last sacrificial breath, Pan opens the way forward. Gabriel proceeds to the closest place to hell, defeating a powerful demon, and reaches the Necromancer's Abyss, Upon reaching the Necromancer at its peak, said Necromancer summons a gigantic Draco-Lich Titan. Gabriel crosses it and defeats it, gaining the final piece of the God Mask. In enters Zobek, with the other mask we saw near the beginning of the game in Gabriel's vision. And here we get a huge exposition dump right at the end. Turns out Picard here is the actual Lord of the Necromancers and the one who set this plot in motion in the first place. He wanted the power to himself, and dove into the depths of hell to find the means to obtain it, when something gave him the knowledge of the dark arts that he needed. With the knowledge, he separated the earth from the heavens, giving Gabriel the reason to go on this quest in the first place. Oh, and Zobek used that devil mask to influence Gabriel to kill Claudia. And Marie.
No! You lie! Bastard!
Search your soul, Gabriel. You know it to be true.
Aw, come on!
And then Zobek seemingly kills Gabriel and revels in his victory. Only the thing that gave him the whole idea for this whole plan? Turns out it's literally Satan. I don't mean that in any figurative capacity, it actually is Satan. And now that Zobek has outlived his usefulness, Satan throws him aside. Meanwhile, the spirits of the dead are about to welcome Gabriel into their fold until Marie intervenes and revives him. And whatever light was left in him. Not that it's much. Satan offers him a place at his side, but Gabriel refuses, leading to the final battle. Gabriel ultimately triumphs and defeats Satan and restores the path between heaven and earth. Gabriel is visited by the grateful spirit of Marie, who reveals that the God Mask allows one to see the world through God's eyes. Oof. With her final words of farewell, Marie ascends to heaven, with Claudia following her shortly thereafter. Gabriel, his last hope revealed to be a fool's venture, is left devastated as the credits roll. And then Gabriel was a Dracula. Oh yeah, that's right, there were 2 DLC epilogue chapters that explain how it happened. Reverie and Resurrection, each of which are $10? Were it not for the sake of this review, I would not have bothered at that price. So in these chapters, which are narrated by Gabriel this time, we pick up where we left off, with a broken Gabriel hearing an SOS from Laura. Turns out that the Bernhardt family, you mean Walter Bernhardt from Lament of Innocence, once summoned a powerful demon known as the Forgotten One. Wow, they're really digging deep for this reboot. But the founders of the Brotherhood fought him back and sealed him in the Plane of Darkness. But now that the Lords of Shadow are defeated, the seal is weakening and Gabriel has to prevent the beast from escaping. So Gabriel and Laura plumb the forgotten depths of the castle and find the gateway to the Dimensional Rift. Only for Gabriel to access the dimension, he needs to consume Laura's blood. Well, that explains how he became a vampire. With his thirst for blood and power growing by the minute, Gabriel confronts the Forgotten One.
Enough talk! Have at you!
But even after 2 battles with the beast, the portal to the human plane opens up. Gabriel, in a last desperate bid to stop the Forgotten One, steals his power, finishes off the demon, and in a final middle finger to his humanity, shatters his old combat cross. Back to the stinger. Turns out Zobek is still alive, and has caught wind that Satan's acolytes are working to revive him, and Zobek needs Dracula's help to stop them. In exchange, Zobek offers Dracula an end to his immortality. Oh, and it's also modern times now, for some reason.
Obvious sequel hook is obvious.
If I could be perfectly honest here, this plot was serviceable. Definitely a lot darker than the camp we'd gotten from the canon timeline, but it does its job all the same. There are plenty of characters that come and go, but at least they don't overstay their welcome. I also appreciate how each of the lords had their own story arc leading up to them. And despite being a hard reboot of the series, I do appreciate how they don't forget its roots as much as I poked fun at all the references. The important thing here is Gabriel's descent into darkness, but a lot of it isn't shown so much as told in the narration, which kinda weakens things a bit. Actually, that leads to one of my issues with the game's conveyance of the story. Zobek's pre-chapter narration, while a nice touch, sometimes tells important details when they could instead have been shown in cutscenes, like the backstory of the Crooked Abbot, who, by the way, only appears in one cutscene and then dies in the same scene, or how Zobek killed Baba Yaga off-screen after her role was finished. However, even his narration prior to the main story's finale doesn't even give a hint to his heel reveal, which honestly comes out of nowhere. Hell, there were even more hints to Satan's reveal as the true main villain, and even that was just the Brotherhood's backstory and one line from the witch. Granted, there was less of this issue during the epilogue DLC, though the story in these chapters felt kind of like an excuse to complete Gabriel's downfall. This is made even more apparent by the change in visual style of the cutscenes, as well as the change in narrator to Gabriel himself, conveying his mental state along with the events that are happening. That being said, Cox considers these chapters to have been a mistake. I guess that explains why they were promptly ignored in the sequels. As shown with the story, this is a decidedly darker Castlevania than series vets are used to, and that extends very much to its presentation and mood. Let's start with the environments. With a few exceptions, they're appropriately bleak. That's not to say that they're poorly lit. On the contrary, I don't recall a single area that was obtrusively dark. Nor is there a lack of color choice. There's actually quite a varied assortment of haunted locales, including marshes, ruins, castles, and more. And truth be told, the environments look pretty good. They convey the moods of their respective locations and avoid feeling too samey. The enemies have a whole wide variety to them, and they look appropriately creepy and appropriate for each story arc. Killing them is, well, this game's rated M for a few reasons. One of which being this game's combat is, well, not for the squeamish. If an enemy bleeds, it will, and the finishers for bosses in particular can be especially yikes-inducing. The models for main characters, however, are a little hit or miss. Gabriel's character model, for example, looks great, and the lords look menacing, but Zobek looks Marie looks kinda sheesh, and Satan, how about we don't? As for the performance, like I said, I played the PS3 version, and it is painfully clear that this game wasn't well optimized for the format. The frame rate tops out at 30 FPS by design, but honestly, in the thick of things, it struggled to even hit that. At the worst of times, it could sink into the mid-teens. Maybe it's better in the PC version, I don't know. Also, there was one spot where the surfaces just became invisible. Granted, that was the only major glitch I ran into, but it was still an issue. On to the sound. The sound direction, if I can be honest, is really on point for the most part. The sounds of combat are rife with clashing steel, the growls and grunts of monsters, and the splatter of viscera. Stuff like machinery sounds like it's supposed to, and other sound effects like magic and electricity typically sound great. The game has some pretty damn good voice acting as well. I've already brought up Sir Patrick Stewart as Zobek, and he sure knows how to ham it up. Robert Carlyle also does a great job as Gabriel, and the voice work in general is solid. As for the music, it felt like it was trying for that epic Lord of the Rings-like feel. And while it does accomplish this feel, to me, it came at the cost of memorability. Maybe it's just me, but nothing really stuck out to me. I only remember a few of the tracks, those being the ones typically reserved for combat, as well as a couple of exploration tracks. And that's only because they were drilled into my head after hearing them so many times.
As a whole, I felt I got more out of these tracks when I was listening to them outside of battle, since, I was focusing more on those instead of combat. And that's okay and all, but, I'm not exactly watching a movie here.
Okay, as much as I had to go over the story in the presentation, we all know that I consider the gameplay to be the linchpin of any game. It's pretty much as important to a game as the middle class is to a nation's economy. So let's go over what we have here. Lords of Shadow is a 3D hack and slash and more or less ticks off all the boxes of the genre. The main story takes place over 12 chapters plus the 2 DLC chapters, each of which consists of as few as 1 stage to as many as 8. The majority of these stages are a straight trek from start to finish, encompassing a combination of the 3 pillars of such titles, those being exploration, combat, and puzzle solving. Gabriel's main weapon is called the Combat Cross, which contains a whip-like retractable chain. This biblical bludgeon is upgradable with a grappling hook, a spiked chain which can be used to tame beasts to clear certain obstacles, after which you can brutally strangle them to death, and a stake which is good for killing vampires and operating machinery. You also get various upgrades as you progress, including a dash and double jump, and 4 sub-weapons, those being the silver daggers which you start with, berries, holy water, and an area nuking dark crystal. You also have access to 2 types of magic. Light, which refills your health with each hit at the cost of magic power, and Shadow, which doubles your attack power also at the cost of magic power. Both of these, along with your life meter, can be increased by finding gems on the corpses of your fallen brethren. Morbid. You can also find scrolls containing important information on said corpses, so at least their deaths weren't in vain. You can also upgrade your sub-weapons by finding Brotherhood arcs, but most of these require returning to previous areas when you have new abilities. In combat, you have powerful direct attacks and weaker AoE attacks which can be comboed together, along with grab moves. Already you can draw parallels to other hack-and-slash games of the time, most notably God of War. Your combos are limited when you start out, but you can gain access to new moves both as you progress and by spending experience points which you gain by defeating enemies and solving puzzles. Though in all seriousness, I only found use for a few of said combos. Most encounters were handled with a combination of standard ground and air combos and common sense. You also gain magical orbs to refill your gauges by defeating enemies, or by finding orb altars. Of course you have defensive options as well, in the form of blocking by holding the left trigger and dodging while pressing the left stick while blocking. Now, while dodging works relatively well, especially since some attacks are unblockable, I do have to question why dodging wasn't simply assigned to the right stick. They don't even give the function to the right stick, which is kind of puzzling, especially with the game's fixed camera angles. More on those later. You can also stagger enemies with a synchronized block, which I recommend mastering early because it also helps you build your focus. Yeah, early on you gain a focus meter which fills as you parry attacks and attack enemies, but you lose it all if you take damage. If you max out your focus, you gain magic orbs with every hit as long as it lasts, which is extremely helpful since unless you're on point defensively, you'll be using your light magic a lot, since, aside from the occasional life altar or life gem, it's the only way to refill your health. You don't even regain health and magic when you complete a level, which is not only baffling, but can screw you over if you're on your last legs when you finish a level. As for the sub-weapons, I appreciate how certain enemies are weak to certain sub-weapons, and their weaknesses make sense in context. Guess which weapons work best on Lycans and on ghouls and vampires. Of course, with combat comes boss battles, and they're divided into two camps, the regular bosses and the titans. The regular bosses are typically rather straightforward, and can be beaten with your skills and judgment. Well, that and QuickTime events. This game has a lot of QTEs, and the penalties for failure range from lost progress to lost lives. Thankfully, they're relatively simple, usually rapidly tapping the button on screen or timing a button press, and they're also integrated into the gameplay, and they're frequent, so they're less egregious. Usually. Probably my favorite boss was the fight with Pan in the Titan Graveyard. The way you have to get your magic back from him and later learn to attack with the opposite magic from him is actually clever and even foreshadows the battle with Satan. Then, there's the Titans. There are 3 such bosses and they are easily the worst in the game. They require you to find a way to climb onto them, hold the grip button when they shake about, reach their runes, and punch them out one by one. And one mistake could lead to you starting a long and tedious sequence from square one. Take a guess where they got this idea. Now the thing with a game like Shadow of the Colossus is that the game is designed around these bosses since they're literally the only enemies in the game. Not so much here. Special mention to the Dragolich being the most slow-going boss in the whole game, where most of the sequence has to be done in a single go. As for the exploration, for the most part, it works. Gabriel generally controls well, and rarely do the controls get in the way. Oftentimes it was because I forgot what it was I needed to do. And while the majority of levels are either boss battles or a trek to the goal, there are several instances where paths fork in different directions, and corpses can be surprisingly well hidden for a land so rife with death. When you upgrade the combat cross, it helps quite a bit with exploration. However, there are a few issues. One is that the game sometimes has trouble holding its fixed camera angles. As I've mentioned before, the game doesn't have a free camera, instead using fixed angles to try and create a more cinematic feel. While most of the time it doesn't have too bad of an effect on gameplay, when it does, it can get pretty jarring. Sometimes the camera can snap to a new angle without warning or giving you a chance to adjust without stopping. That can get annoying at times. Also, the level design has a lot of climbing. You're likely to spend about 20% of your time on the walls. And the third thing that can come up is that for a game with so much hidden stuff, it's certainly fond of the point of no return. If you miss a collectible, there's always the chance you'll hit one of these points, and your only course of action is to restart the level or come back later. Lovely. And then there's puzzle solving. There's actually quite a variety of puzzles in the game, and most of them aren't that bad. Some of them involve interacting with the puzzle from the outside, such as the chest puzzles in the DLC. Others are woven into the level, such as the statue sliding puzzles which involve the gauntlet, or the mirror puzzles in the Abbey. Usually you can find a hint in a scroll on a nearby fallen knight, and you can even bypass them at the cost of the experience rewards. Most of these puzzles are intuitive and well thought out. Except the ones that require the downward punch. When I said that Gabriel generally controls well, this move is the biggest exception. The puzzles with switches on the ground would have been a lot easier if you could just punch straight down. Instead, you go at an awkward angle and you have to be at just the right distance and angle from the switch in order to hit it. And since Gabriel doesn't turn on a dime, well, this was easier said than done. Oh, and to add injury to insult, there's a mini-boss in Chapter 7 that integrates this kind of switch as well.
Now, it could be just me, but these puzzles felt like the only ones in the game that tested my patience instead of my brain.
At the end of the night, Lords of Shadow is decent. The game ticks off pretty much all the boxes of the hack-and-slash genre, and most of it works well enough. At the same time, however, I found too many issues with the game to consider it any more than decent. But perhaps the biggest problem with this game is that it doesn't do enough to stand out, either as a reboot of Castlevania, or as a hack-and-slash in general. A game can be competent as all heck, but if it doesn't do anything to distinguish itself, it's gonna wind up forgotten. And I'm pretty sure that this is the fate that would have befallen Lords of Shadow were it not for the Castlevania name. Without the legacy of its legendary franchise, it would have been just another generic hack-and-slash riding on the coattails of games like God of War that would have been left to rot in the grave dug by the more successful titles. And to be honest, I'm glad I found this game at a bargain price because it didn't feel like it would have been worth a full price purchase. It's worth picking up used, but your blood intake will definitely vary.
I'm the Quarter Guy, and considering we got a sequel hook in the first place, I'm thinking Konami was planning to make the sequel to this game regardless of the game's sales. And before anyone asks, no, I currently have no plans to play Lords of Shadow 2. I hear Mirror of Fate's pretty good, though.
So, a golem with connections to Rita Repulsa, a deranged chemist who swims in his own chemicals, a trio of pile drivers, a robot made of bouncy balls, an electric dude with a pet rabbit, an ice-skating Arctic observer, a fire safety robot who studies martial arts, and an explosive expert who works at a theme park walk into a bar. Wait, where was I going with this? Never mind. Next time, ranking the Robot Masters of Mega Man 11. It's game time!